When I initially began making my series on the Byzantine emperors, I figured that a lot of people would want to hear about Basil the Bulgar Slayer or Alexius Comnenus. However, the most requested emperor, and by a long shot, is Constantine V Copronymus. And in this video, I really hope that I live up to the expectations of the people who have been anticipating this video for a few months at this point. I would like to look at Constantine and what makes him so fascinating to both modern audiences and to the Byzantines themselves. He was a figure of some controversy in the sources. Two things stand out before we go into his life in detail. One is that of all of the iconoclast emperors, Constantine V is the most staunch in his belief and in his practice of avoiding the use of icons. He was semi-fanatical about it. And the other noteworthy thing about Constantine, if you're doing the Cliff's Note version, is that he is the emperor who really got Byzantium back on the offensive for the first time really since Heraclius. Now, other emperors had mounted some attacks here or there, but Constantine throughout his reign will be on the offensive in both the east and the west, and it looks like he wins the majority of the battles that he fights. So let's go into detail and look at what makes Constantine V Copronymus. Constantine was born in 718, and he was then crowned as co-emperor in 720. For context, Leo III, his father, had only seized power in 717, so Constantine was born very early in Leo's reign. His nickname, Copronymus, shit-named, comes from a time when the infant Constantine was baptized and given his name. Well, something went wrong when he was being baptized. He happened to defecate in the baptismal water, at least according to hostile iconodule sources. So, therefore, he earned the nickname Copronymus, or shit-named. Now, the meaning of this is twofold. One, it is supposed to be a bit of a joke, and it's clearly trying to sully Constantine in a direct way by comparing him with shit. But the other thing is a little more subtle, and the idea is that since baptism is a sacrament, then the fact that Constantine's was a bit botched means that there's something wrong with him, that he's not straight in the eyes of God. So this is a way for hostile iconophile sources to smear him and make him look religiously illegitimate. So it's actually a fairly clever ploy, and it's not as immature as it seems at first glance. It's a fairly sophisticated smear if you accept the premises of people at the time. His first wife was the daughter of a Khazar Khan. Her name was Tzizak. Later, when she moved to Constantinople, she changed her name to Irene, which is a Greek name. And the couple was married in 732 when young Constantine was 14 years old. Later on, he'll have two other wives. In 741, when Leo III died, it appeared that Constantine V was in store for a smooth succession. The only major problem in the empire at this time was that iconoclasm was still divisive. However, the empire had officially had iconoclasm now for about 11 years, and despite some resentment, it hadn't really sparked, say, a major revolt or something of that nature, so Constantine V had no real worries on that front, most likely. When he came to power, he was 22 to 23 years old, and he had been associated with the throne for about 20 years, so people were accustomed to seeing him on coins, and he was well established and presumably relatively experienced in government. So it seems like, from what we can tell, he spent his first year or so in the capital consolidating his power and doing other things, and then after about a year he decided that it was time to go out and go on campaign, and that's when he faced his first crisis. Let's now take a look at the first major challenge that was presented to Constantine V, the Revolt of Artabasdus. If you want to hear a full version of this revolt, then I recommend that you check out my video on Artabasdus. But for now, we'll just keep it rather brief. In the summer of 742, Constantine V was marching through Asia Minor on his way to the eastern frontier, where he was going to launch an attack on the Umayyad Caliphate. But as he was on the march, one of his most important retainers, Artabasdus, revolted. The two of them fought an open battle. Artabasdus was victorious. Now, rather than following up Constantine and trying to finish him off once and for all, Artabasdus decided to make straight for Constantinople, where he was able to claim the crown, and he was able to restore the icons, which then made him popular with a certain group in the empire. Constantine, for his part, retreated to the city of Amorium in Asia Minor, which had been his father's thematic capital before he had revolted in 717. The two forces spent the winter of 742-743 gathering men and gearing up for a final confrontation, and in the spring of 743, both claimants were ready to battle it out to be the true heir of Leo III. And the reason why this is a real struggle is because Artabasdus had some degree of legitimacy, since he was the son-in-law of Leo and had helped him come to the throne all the way back in 717. Not to mention that he had grandchildren who, he had children who were the grandchildren of Leo, so he also could claim to be every bit as, or at least pretty close to as legitimate as Constantine V himself. So this was a severe challenge, and it also showed that if Constantine V had thought that the icon issue maybe wasn't all that dangerous, that he had miscalculated. During the campaign of 743, Constantine first demonstrates his military talent. He faced Artabasdus or his sons 3 different times in Asia Minor and was victorious on all 3 occasions. After thoroughly defeating the armies of Artabasdus, Constantine crossed into Europe and laid siege to Constantinople. In November of 743, the city surrendered to Constantine, and then he entered the city, had Artabasdus and his sons deposed and blinded, and resumed his rule. And by the way, this image apparently comes from a manuscript and might be the most accurate physical depiction of Constantine V. So, if YouTube doesn't give me the option of using the title slide as a thumbnail, then you're looking at the image which will become the thumbnail. And I guess if you clicked on the video and this already was the thumbnail, then that would be odd, but obviously I'm recording all this before I get to see what images YouTube will offer me as defaults. Yeah, this is sort of some inside the studio stuff. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. But at any rate, let's move on. The thing that Constantine V is best known for is his iconoclasm, and in particular, his intense iconoclasm. Now, Leo III had also been an iconoclast, and he had banned the use of icons in 730. However, Leo had never persecuted anyone or tried to remove them from power because they believed that icons were acceptable. However, Constantine V was far more interested in theology than his father had ever been, and his belief in banning icons was absolute. So, oftentimes scholars assume that because Artabasdus was able to embrace the iconodule position and gain a lot of public support, that this really incensed Constantine, and also the fact that so many icons popped up after Artabasdus restored them that Constantine realized that his father's policies hadn't gone far enough or been effective. So he decided that he needed to go further, since he did regard icons as being impious and an insult to the empire and imperial authority. There's also another possibility that no one has brought up to the best of my knowledge. Perhaps because Constantine was so theologically motivated, it's possible that when he first came to power, he was talking loosely about intensifying iconoclastic policies, and that this is why so many people were willing to embrace Artabasdus. Maybe Constantine created some of the backlash that Artabasdus was able to take advantage of by talking about, moving towards something like a persecution. And we'll notice that there's a fairly considerable gap between Constantine retaking the throne in 743 and then actually implementing a full-scale persecution in 754. And this may be because he was biding his time and waiting to do something that he had intended to do even before Artabasdus had revolted. But this is just speculation on my part. I don't really know for sure, but neither do the people who say that Artabasdus Revolt is what sparked Constantine to go a step further. Source limitations really prevent us from being able to fully trace the evolution of Constantine V's thoughts on whether or not he should persecute people who believe in icons and go a step further than his father had gone by just simply banning the use of icons. However, we do know that by 754, Constantine V had made up his mind and he had decided that it was necessary to persecute people who worshipped using icons. So, he convened a council at Hira in that year, 754, and this council was packed full of iconoclasts, and their purpose was not to debate this issue, but rather to simply pass measures that were discriminatory against iconophiles. We do know from later sources which quoted some of what Constantine said that his argument seems to have been that the very existence of icons and their depiction of Christ in human form had a lot of unorthodox implications about the nature of Christ. So he was bringing Christology into this, and of course that's a big can of worms that has come up over and over and over already in the series, and many emperors had fallen afoul of issues regarding the nature of Christ. Anyway, the persecution itself, the purpose of it seems to have been to root out iconodules from the army and the bureaucracy. Maybe that's why so many scholars think that this was inspired by the support that Artabasdus got. Constantine V thought that the only people who could be truly loyal were the people who shared his religious beliefs. It's also possible, though, that if Leo III had banned icons in the first place because he thought that this was the source of God's displeasure against the Byzantines, then maybe Constantine V thought that the best way to promote the welfare of the state was to ban people who were impure in their religious thought, and that this would be pleasing to God and good for the empire. At any rate, it's kind of hard to say with any degree of full certainty. Constantine V also heavily targeted monasteries, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And the reason why he hated monasteries so much is because monks tended to be the biggest supporters of icons and also the people most likely to hide them places and prevent imperial authorities from finding and destroying them. And although the council had some limits as to what they were willing to do, these were all priests and, not an emperor who was bent on really reforming by force and state power. But Constantine actually ended up going beyond what the council decided, and he actually condemned all saint cults and relics as being in the family of icons. The only one that he didn't condemn was the cult of the Virgin Mary. He clearly had a lot of theological beliefs, and he was a very fervent believer. And as emperor, he thought that it was both his right and his duty to enforce his beliefs on others. And he spent a considerable amount of his time doing this. Although, as we'll see, he did plenty of other things as well, and he presumably was not a full-blown obsessive. Constantine V's persecution of iconodules hit two groups of people in particular. One group are officials, people who are either in the civil service or in the army, and the other group are monks and nuns. For monks and nuns, the thinking is that they can potentially be socially disruptive, and also that they are often the people who are hiding a lot of these icons and perpetuating what Constantine V saw as an impious act. However, he also had a desire to better utilize the empire's manpower and resources. The more people who go into monasteries, the fewer soldiers Constantine has, and also the fewer people who will be having children who will then grow up to be future soldiers. So, in Constantine's mind, he wanted to keep the number of people who were celibate to somewhat of a minimum. So his idea was to use this opportunity presented by iconoclasm to do just that. So once he had an assembly of monks and nuns in the hippodrome, paired them off, and then forced them to marry or otherwise face blinding and exile. So he essentially got rid of two groups of people he saw as unproductive and potentially disruptive in his society. And his thought was that they would then go on to be productive citizens and produce future soldiers for his armies. In addition to going after individual monks and nuns, Constantine also went after monastic property, and he used the money from that for the benefit of the state and his army. As we'll see, he fought plenty of wars, and I imagine that the expenses for those had to run quite high. Based on Constantine's persecution of iconophiles, and the fact that it was those very iconophiles who ended up writing the history, it should now not be much of a mystery as to why he was called Copronymus the shit-named. So, you might think, well, he must have been a deeply unpopular emperor if he got saddled with that name. Well, the thing is, actually, there's pretty good evidence that he was actually pretty popular overall, and that he was a well-loved emperor by most of the population. And that begs the question, well, how was he popular if you have a large chunk of the empire, a group that's highly influential with the population as a whole, namely the monks? How did he overcome the hostility of such an influential group in society and maintain his popularity? Well, it appears that his popularity came from two sources. One is that he was popular because he won the vast majority of his battles. And two, and probably more importantly, he was able to provide inexpensive and abundant food to the population of the capital. So what it appears is that he was able to find a grain source and then subsidize it in order to keep people in the city fed. Something that hadn't been the case since the time of Heraclius, after the Byzantines lost control of Egypt, which had been their breadbasket for the city of Constantinople. So this was a major thing that would make someone popular, and it also will enable the city of Constantinople to begin to grow once again, since cities of that size can't really provide for themselves, and they rely heavily on imports that are subsidized. In 717, Leo and Artabasdus had been strategoi who revolted and seized the throne. So, as the son of Leo and the former opponent of Artabasdus, Constantine V was well aware of the danger of the strategoi governing themes. And his thematic reform, which resulted in the creation of the tagmata, was probably informed heavily by his knowledge of recent history. So, Constantine redrew the boundaries of the themes just a bit. This was designed to weaken the strategoids a little so they would be less menacing to the emperor. And while doing that, he also formed new units in the capital. Now, older units in the capital had been designed to guard the palace and to keep public order, and these troops could still do that. But now they are given additional tasks. And this new design for these units, the tagmata, is that something that they're supposed to be able to do is to form a corps for when the emperor goes on campaign. So he'll have these units of professional heavy cavalry, and then he can draw up some thematic troops that he raises along the way, and then together they form an army. So what this shows is not only Constantine's concern for security, but also his emphasis on being able to mount offensives on the empire's borders against its foreign foes. So this is a reform which has a twofold impact. And these units, the singular for tagmata is tagma. These tended to be composed of around 200 to 400 men. I'd like to take a look at what was going on in the Arab world during Constantine V's time. Now, if you'll recall, in the summer of 742, Constantine was eager to get to his eastern frontier in order to attack the Umayyad Caliphate. And he had good reason for wanting to attack the Umayyads, since at this time they were fairly disorganized and suffering from a lot of internal tension, and this led to opportunities for the Byzantines to expand and also to raid into Umayyad territory. So let's look at what was going on within the Umayyad Caliphate itself. At this time, the Caliphate was really riven with religious and political tensions, and these tensions boiled over in 750 when the Abbasids revolted against the Umayyad dynasty. It's called the Abbasid Revolution, and this really comes to a head in 750 when the Umayyad family is almost entirely wiped out and the House of Abbas takes control of the Caliphate. Now, because of this civil war and the decision of the Abbasids to relocate the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, Arab concentration will no longer be so heavily directed against the Byzantine Empire. And if you're Constantine V and his successors, that's great news. So, because the Arabs at this time are so busy fighting each other, this means that Constantine V will have an opening to do some damage and make a name for himself. Capitalizing on this Arab weakness, Constantine V mounted at least 3 major eastern campaigns. In 746, he invaded Syria, and he was able to capture his father's hometown of Germanica. He then resettled some of the local Christians in Thrace. There was still an ongoing long-term policy of population relocation. This was to make people more loyal to the emperor than to their locality, and also to repeople the Balkans with people loyal to the Byzantine state. In 747, Byzantine naval forces were able to defeat an Arab fleet off of the island of Cyprus. This was another major victory. Although Constantine V was not present, this would have been really good news for him. This points to the re-expansion of Byzantine naval power all the way into the far reaches of the Eastern Mediterranean, whereas at certain points in the not too distant past, they had been more or less confined to the area around Constantinople, and they had had the Arabs island hop at their expense at one point. So this means that Byzantine power is back in a way that doesn't really get talked about enough. This return of the Byzantine navy to being an offensive force in the Eastern Mediterranean is a pretty big deal, and it's unfortunate that we don't know more details about that. His last major invasion of the Abbasid Caliphate occurred in 752, and during that year he captured Theodosiopolis in Armenia, and he also took the city of Melitene, and he took a lot of captives during that campaign, and he resettled a whole lot of them in the Balkans. After this point, he made peace with the Abbasid Caliphate, and then he focused his attentions westward. Constantine V did shift his attention to the west, but he shifted that attention to the Balkans and not to Italy, where momentous things were happening. In 751, the Lombards finally succeeded in capturing Ravenna, and by taking the capital of Byzantine northern Italy, they effectively ended the Exarchate of Ravenna once and for all. That is a long-term consequence of both Leo III and Constantine V neglecting Italy and embracing iconoclasm, which alienated the Pope and many of their own subjects in Italy. At this point, because the Byzantines were distant, disinterested, and heretical, the Pope felt a lot more comfortable turning to Pepin and the Franks, who he was beginning to see as something other than just another northern barbarian kingdom, and as a real ally. The Franks had the advantage of being Catholic and very unambiguously so, and they also were now powerful enough and willing to get involved on the Pope's behalf in Italy, so at this point they seemed like a more useful ally. And because the Byzantines under Constantine V and his successors will continue to neglect Italy and not really make all that much of an effort to reconcile with Rome, this relationship between the Franks and the papacy will continue to deepen, and eventually in the year 800, almost 50 years after the fall of Ravenna, and some 25 or so years after the death of Constantine V, we'll see that the Pope crowns a Roman emperor who has no connection at all to the Byzantine Empire, named Charlemagne. And had Constantine V reversed his father's policies in Italy, maybe there would be no Charlemagne. So it's something to think about. This is sort of a long-term repercussion of the policies of the Isaurian dynasty. The fact that Charlemagne was able to take up the title of Roman Emperor. After 755, the primary thing that preoccupied Constantine V was fighting against the Bulgarians in the Balkans. It seems like he had an intention of making war on them from a fairly early date, and he was fortifying his border with Bulgaria when the Bulgar Khan sent an emissary and informed him that this was a violation of a treaty that the two powers had signed back in 716. Constantine V did not desist from his activities, however, and the Bulgar Khan declared war, thus starting an intermittent series of wars between 755 and 775, during the course of which Constantine V led his armies in person about 9 times or so, with the intent of eliminating or reducing the power of Bulgaria. So let's talk more about what Constantine V was doing at the border in 755. It looks like what he was doing is resettling a lot of the Armenians and Syrians who had come with him from his eastern campaigns, and he was putting them along his border with the Bulgars. And for the Bulgar Khan Kormasash, this was an act of war and a violation of the treaty from 716. So, to retaliate and show his displeasure, Kormasash began raiding near Constantinople, but Constantine V came out, met him, and defeated him in battle. And the next year in 756, Constantine decided to go out and seek retribution more thoroughly. So he sent a fleet of about 500 ships to hit the Danube basin. It was supposed to be a bit of a diversion, and then he went overland with his main force and clashed with the Bulgar army at the border fort of Marcellae. And at this battle, the Byzantines were successful, and the Bulgarians were forced to send hostages to Constantinople in order to persuade Constantine to call off the invasion and end hostilities before things got even worse for the Bulgarians. In 759, Constantine V decided once again to invade Bulgaria using an overland route. Chances are that he wanted to repeat his success from 756, and that he thought that this was something that was relatively safe to do. However, Khan Vanek had other plans for him. So the Bulgarians barred several possible mountain passes and forced Constantine to rely on just one, the Rishki Pass. And as the Byzantines were passing through this pass, the Bulgarians ambushed them. We don't know the exact numbers, but the Byzantine losses were pretty severe and included the Strategos of Thrace. After this battle, Vanek did not follow up his success, even though he could have, and ultimately this really pissed off the pro-war element in Bulgaria, and it led to the rise of a new Khan named Telets, who took power in 761. The new Bulgarian Khan Telets looted Byzantine territory in 763, and this inspired Constantine V to go out in pursuit. Constantine loaded up about 9,600 cavalry on 800 transports and set out in pursuit. On June 16th, 463, this would lead to the Battle of Anchialus, the greatest battle between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians to this point, and Constantine V's greatest victory over them. The reason why Constantine was able to win this battle is because Telets badly miscalculated. When Constantine and his forces landed, they were on the low ground, and Telets and the Bulgarians occupied the high ground. However, for whatever reason, Telets decided that it was a good idea to abandon the high ground and march down to the lowlands and fight a head-on battle. The result was a bloody slugfest that went from 10 a.m. all the way to sunset and resulted in a decisive but costly Byzantine victory. 2 years later, Telets was overthrown for his failures, and that would have been well and good, but Constantine and his heirs really failed to follow up on this victory, and ultimately both sides were able to inflict one big defeat on the other, but neither side was really able to take advantage if we look at the cumulative impact of Rishki Pass and then Anchialus. The Battle of Anchialus in 763 is the last known event in Constantine V's life. However, we do know quite a bit more about his personal life. So, after Irene, the former Khazar princess, died, Constantine V then married a woman named Maria, and when she died, he then married a woman named Eudokia. His eldest son was Leo IV. He was a son of Irene, but Constantine also elevated his sons Nicephorus and Christopher to the rank of Caesar as well. He also had a grandson by Leo IV, whose name was Constantine VI, and he was already about 4 years old in 775 when Constantine V died. So there were essentially 3 generations of Isaurian emperors alive and kicking at the same time for at least 4 years, although Constantine VI had not actually been crowned yet. So that, I think, is kind of a fun fact, especially once you have watched the 2 subsequent videos on Leo IV and Constantine VI. In 775, under circumstances that are far from clear, the new Bulgarian Khan Telerig managed to persuade Constantine V to reveal all of his agents in Bulgaria, and then, contrary to the agreement, Telerig had them all killed. Well, Constantine V was infuriated by this, and he was in the midst of making a new expedition against Bulgaria when he died on campaign on September 14th, 775. If my math is correct, that would make him 57 years old at the time of his death. This is a coin from Khan Telerig, by the way, if you're wondering what this is. Constantine V was able to succeed due to a combination of solid planning, perseverance, and good luck, and the end result of his reign was that he left the empire quite a bit stronger than he found it. His Tagmata reform was an unqualified success. We can tell that by the fact that he was only defeated once that we know of, and that in almost every other battle he was able to emerge victorious. That's a pretty good record, and it speaks not only to his ability as a general, but also to the effectiveness of his military system. However, he is the most reviled emperor in the sources, and that is due to his persecution of the Iconodules, or Iconophiles, whichever term you prefer. However, contemporaries seem to have mostly liked Constantine V, and they saw him as a success. And I think that their judgment was right. If you leave the empire stronger than you found it, then you are a success. That being said, the fact that Constantine V was a persecutor is something that, kind of leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Nonetheless, he is an interesting guy, and after his death, we'll see that Byzantium will be hard-pressed to come up with someone of equal worth for quite a long time.